Hi, welcome back. I am finally ready to begin my coverage of World War I, 1914 through 1918, designed by Jim Dunnigan and originally published in 1975 by SPI as part of their Strategy and Tactics magazine. This is issue number 51, so if you pick up this version of the game, make sure yours comes with this, which includes, of course, an article on the topic, especially helpful if you're not that familiar. It's a very kind of brief overview of the onset and development of the war, and it contains also some smaller articles that give you a little perspective of one aspect or another, no man's land or the naval war, infiltration tactics, things like that. We also have some nice maps here of the western and eastern fronts, depicting the frontline positions and how that developed over the course of the war. And of course, we can't go without a description of the various war plans and I talk about the Schlieffen Plan and modified Schlieffen and Plan 17, etc. I like this line. While the Germans were preparing to sweep across France like a giant scythe, the French were planning to pierce the German center like a rapier. Then we have kind of short little segments here describing each of the major campaigns and battles, starting with the Battle of the Frontiers and describing the race to the sea, the Tannenberg campaign, western, eastern fronts, the Back Door, Kaiserschlacht. And then a little bonus here at the back, statistical comparison of the First and Second World Wars, total mobilized, and total wounded, casualties, military and civilian, and dollar amount and cost. So very informative, and then we have a section here on the game itself, including simulation notes, what looks like a strategy guide for both of the players, the Central Powers and the Allies. I haven't really looked at this and don't plan to, at least not for a while. And then we have something that I really like, and similar to what we saw in the Arduous Beginning, which is the game is history. Generally describing what happened historically over the course of the months that correspond to a game turn, which in this case is semi-annual, a total of 10 turns. A really short little paragraph for each. And then some other material that doesn't really have anything to do with this game or topic. And then of course the rules to the game, which I think have been removed from my copy and separated and left in the bedroom. So while we have missed out on the centennial of the beginning of the war, we made it in time to do the playthrough during the 40th anniversary of the game's publication. So we're gonna go with that. Not as exciting, but still pretty cool in terms of wargaming history. And if you're not familiar, this is a very impromptu and informal sneak peek into my private solo board gaming life. So I like to do an introduction video that includes an overview of the components and the rules, and I do it that way instead of embedding all of this within the playthrough so that I have something specific that I can refer back to when I revisit the game in the future and inevitably don't remember how to play the game at all. Of course, if you're using these videos in a similar fashion, make sure you pay attention to the description boxes below the videos, where I try to keep a running log of all the mistakes that I've noticed and those that have been pointed out to me graciously. So with that, I guess we can get started. Let's take a look at the map and our components. Here's the board set up with the units in their starting locations per the historical scenario. There's also a free deployment option you can use instead, I guess for added replayability or if you feel like experimenting or changing things up. The map itself is, I think, half the size of your standard one mapper, which is great because you have all this space you can clutter with food and stuff as you play the game. The map depicts the area between the North and Baltic Seas and Mediterranean and Black Seas here in the south. We have Western Russia, Vilna, Kiev, Odessa. Here's Germany, with Berlin right there, I believe. It's hard to tell from back here. We have part of France, including Paris. You can see here the Western Front starting in along the French border, entering Belgium, and here's the Netherlands. Over here we have a large part of Italy and Austria-Hungary here in the center. And down here we have Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, Constantinople down here, and then Greece. There's Athens. So you can probably tell from the map that this is primarily focusing on the land aspect of the conflict, with some maybe naval aspects very much abstracted. Here's a close-up of the Western Front. Here's the French border. This dot's Paris. This sliver here is Belgium. Here we have the Netherlands, Western Germany, a little piece of northern Italy, connecting back to France by this Franco-Italian transit area, which I'll probably explain more in detail once we get to that in the playthrough. Each hex is about 70 kilometers across, or roughly 43.5 miles, about the same distance as, say, Everett to SeaTac if you're from around here. And we have, of course, different types of terrain that's detailed in the terrain key down below on the map. There's also a terrain effects chart, which explains the effect that it has on combat and the movement point cost to enter such terrain. This is printed on the back of the rules. But very briefly, here we have clear terrain, which of course costs 1 movement point to enter. These shaded hexes are rough terrain, costs 2 to enter, provides +1 when defending. We have rail hexes. Rail lines cost 1/3 of a movement point to move along. Coastal hexes, blocked hex sides, which prohibit movement. We have these blue icons, which denote resource centers, which provide victory points at the end of the game to the player controlling it. And I don't think it has any other effect on movement or combat. And then we have fortifications like this. This one has a strength of 1. I think they range from 1 to 3. Metz here has a strength of 3, and they may be destroyed. And we have 2 different types of supply cities, dependent and independent. So this down here in Milan is a resource center and also an independent supply city, which is shown by this partially shaded in area. And then we have this right here, Frankfurt, which is also a resource center and a dependent supply city. So for units that need to trace supply, for the central power units, they need to trace supply to at least 2 of their dependent supply cities. And the dependent supply cities that they trace their line of supply to must also be able to trace supply between each other. Zones of control are suppressive in this game in terms of supply line tracing and retreat paths. They're also considered rigid and inactive. Rigid in terms of movement, sticky but not locking. You cannot move from enemy zone of control directly to another, but you can move out once and then back in. There's no extra movement point cost to exit or enter. It's a lot like Strike Force 1. There's no stacking either, so it's a lot like that game also in that regard. And it's inactive, so you're not obligated to attack any units that are adjacent to the beginning of your combat phase. The units themselves each represent, generally speaking, an infantry army. There are a couple of other special units that may enter the game later, the Stoßtruppen and the French tank army. There's some special rules and then other optional rules. I'm not sure if the tank army is, it looks like it's an optional rule, and if it's optional, I'm not going to use it in this playthrough. Each nation's units are color-coded. Hopefully you can tell by where they are geographically, the setup of the game, but we have the this dark blue unit, for example, is the British Expeditionary Force. Here we have the Belgian army. We have 3 German armies that start out in Belgium, and then 1 in France. 1 has crossed the border here and occupies this resource center. You can see the GE tells us how to set up historically. And then we have other neutral units on the board. Italy, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, Romania, which have not yet entered the war. And they can enter either side, depending on how things evolve. So if a country decides to invade a neutral country, then the invaded country will join, of course, the opponent's team. So that's where these kind of numbers come into play, and that represents the number of victory points awarded to the non-invading player if that country is ever invaded while neutral. And once a country joins one of the player's sides, the Central Powers or the Entente side, they can never switch teams. And another way a neutral country can enter the game is by the schedule on the turn record track, which I'll show you here in a moment. Kind of all over the place, apologies for that. But before we talk about the turn record track, let's take a quick look over here at the Balkans, specifically Albania and Greece. You'll notice that there are no units set up in Albania. When invaded, they don't offer any military units, but they do offer 5 victory points to the non-invading player. Greece has some special rules. If invaded by the Allies, both its armies are removed from the game, and it provides 5 victory points to the Central Powers. But if invaded by the Central Powers, the units stay. But if at any point the Allies enter Greece, these armies are removed from the game, regardless of their alliances. And here's Serbia, by the way. No victory point value as they begin the game in the war. The units themselves have 2 factors, the attack strength and the defense strength. All of the units have a movement allowance of 5 movement points. And of course, the neutral country also enters the war if they're attacked, not only if they're invaded, or if the turn record track says it's time for them to enter. So here's the turn record track. Here you see the game turn marker on turn 1, the summer of 1914. On turn 2, Turkey would enter the war if it hasn't already. Turn 3, Italy, then Bulgaria. We have a variable Romanian entry, the German Stoßtruppen, US units, 1 in turn 8, 2 in turn 9. The end of the game. Below the turn track here in blue is the Combat Resource Point Schedule, or CRIPS as they call it in the rulebook. You've probably noticed the track above the map, with the marker for each nation, color-coded. So these are representing manpower, money, material capacity of a nation, and is used to absorb losses during combat, which I'm looking forward to seeing. And you can also spend them to build units. and I think you can spend to rebuild destroyed fortifications if they're in supply. There's a lot of little tiny details in the rules that I'm obviously skipping over, like how supply affects rail movement, etc. But those are things we will cover once we get into the playthrough. You could also lend or borrow crypts from your fellow allies. There's a little summary there at the back of lenders and potential borrowers, and that's another thing that I'm not quite sure how it'll turn out. I just know that there's certain eligibility requirements to be able to borrow from certain lenders. And we have here victory points if Russia collapses and surrenders. So 100 points awarded to the Central Powers player if Russia surrenders on turn 1, and that gradually decreases over the course of the game. By the way, since we start the game with Germany in Belgium, the Entente player starts the game with 5 victory points for that. And below the turn record track is our convenient phase and a sequence of play and a little marker to keep track of that. And we start game turn 1 with the first superior player's attack phase. So you'll see we have Allied movement followed by central movement. Allied movement can be any movement by land, rail, or sea. However, the Central Powers can only move by land, normal land or rail. And then we have the superior player determination phase to see who has the greater amount of total crypts. And if it's tied, it's the Central Powers. You only count the actively allied nations. And then we have 3 different attack phases, starting with the superior player's first attack phase, then the inferior player's attack phase. Then you do that twice more, and then you end with the crypt allocation and build phase, where you adjust your crypts and you can place any newly arriving units, like the US units, on turns 8 and 9 during this phase. Build new armies, lend and borrow crypts amongst your countries, and at the end, all out-of-supply units and fortifications are destroyed. So the Allied player can take advantage of sea movement by moving a unit from a coastal hex to another coastal hex, expending its entire movement allowance of 5 movement points to do so, but they can only move 1 Allied unit using sea movement per turn, and that unit has to be a French, British, or US unit. The arrival hex becomes a link to its supply source on the western edge of the map, and by the way, the Russians trace supply to the eastern edge. And there's some historical chrome dealing with Allied sea movement, specifically the Dardanelles and access to the Black Sea. Basically, if any neutral or enemy unit occupies any of these southern Turkish coastal hexes from the Dardanelles to Constantinople, then any hex east of that unit, any coastal hex east of that unit is prohibited. Actually, any coastal hex in the Black Sea is prohibited until the fortification in Constantinople is eliminated. Here's a close-up of the CRT, which is based on differentials instead of odds, which reminds me of Strike Force 1 again, and Napoleonic 20. It's been a while since I've seen a differential-based CRT. Anyway, it gives you the option of rolling a d6 or drawing chits labeled 1 through 6, and I'd be curious to find out if any of you have played war games drawing chits instead of rolling dice, or if you still do. Anyway, the results are 2 numbers separated by a slash. The number to the left is the attackers' losses, the number to the right, the defenders. By the way, units must be in supply to attack. If defending units are out of supply, their strength is halved, rounded up. And then after that, you would add the +1 for rough terrain, if any, and then +2 on winter turns, even numbered turns. Units may not attack across blocked hex sites. They don't require crypts to attack either. And if it's the first or second attack phases, remember there are 3. Units, if able, must retreat or expend crypts to absorb losses, if able. It's a lot like Red Winter in that you can retreat, and each hex that you retreat counts as 1 loss absorbed. You have to, if possible, I think, retreat in a straight line within your nation's border. I have to look at that when we get into combat during the playthrough. Yeah. And then if it's the 3rd attack phase, you may voluntarily destroy your units instead. I think fortifications may always voluntarily be destroyed, regardless of the attack phase. And as the attacking player, of course, you would target a single hex which would contain 1 unit, as there's no stacking. You can move through friendly units, you just can't end your movement phase in a friendly occupied hex. And if there are losses to be applied, if you decide you want to apply those to the units themselves, you can, it's up to your own discretion how you apply those losses. And it's suggested, there's a tip in the rulebook that suggests you combine attacks of German units with Austro-Hungarian units so that you can apply any potential losses to the Austro-Hungarian units and keep the German units intact, as they benefit from a bonus when attacking Russian and Romanian units. Russian and Romanian units defending against German units, or any combination of German units and their allies, suffer double the losses. Retreating is also kind of, I think, better explained in action during the playthrough, but there's basically this kind of idea of displacement and displacement chain reaction. Yeah, so you're not necessarily going to be retreating. If your retreat path is friendly occupied, you would basically move back and then bump the friendly unit out of its location, and it would kind of chain react towards the end of the back of the line. It's hard to explain, and we'll get to it if we do during the playthrough. And I might as well mention there's also, of course, advancing, what do they call it? It's funny because the rulebook doesn't really use terminology that I've grown accustomed to, because it feels like it's still in development. Advance as a result of combat, I think is what they call it. And you can do multi-hex advancing along the retreat path. We'll see all that during the playthrough. Victory conditions, I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the video, which I usually like to do, so you have a context for all of these rules, what you're striving towards. It's based on a victory point system, and the player with the most points at the end of the game is the winner. Ties are possible. We're kind of reading this together. I don't think I got this far in the rules anyway. So, victory points for territorial objectives. Each player scores 5 victory points for each resource center, the pick and shovel icons that I mentioned in the beginning. If they control it, if they're the last to occupy or pass through it, or if they started the game in possession of it, and the enemy never passed through it. Merely placing resource center in a unit zone of control is not good enough. Unlike Red Winter, the unit must actually physically enter the hex. Central Powers, victory points for Russian surrender we saw on the game turn track. That's a special rule. I guess we'll talk about it in the playthrough. And then victory points for neutrality violation. We've seen those numbers in parentheses. You add all of those together. What is this? Automatic Allied Blockade Award. In both games, as a simulation of the British naval blockade of Germany, the Allies are awarded 75 victory points. Okay, so you add everything together and determine the winner. And it's as simple as that, plus a whole bunch of other stuff that I have not mentioned. And apologies for any mistakes, any slip-ups, mispronunciations, etc. With that, we're going to get started with our learning game. Hopefully by the end of it, I'll have a better grasp of the rules and maybe even some of the general strategy of the game.